Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today we are back with David Bocarsly, the head of JPAC. David, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So you were one of the first guests that I ever had on my podcast. This must have been 4 years ago. Nothing really new has happened in the Jewish world in the last 4 years, so I don't know what we'll talk about.
Yeah, things have been static. Everything has been good. The Jewish community is safe. It's, not
I
much to say.
think I think I'm allowed to make those jokes now that I'm officially a dad. Those sort of very old man Jewish humor jokes. One of the things, there's so much to talk about in terms of what you work on, which is specifically California and Jewish community, interacting with politics there, what gets funded, what does not get funded, all of that stuff. One of the battlegrounds that I think has shifted, and I'm going to ask you, is this really shifted or is this just people are talking about it more, is I don't remember ever hearing about, middle school and high school being a tension point around education curriculum. Obviously, it was always in the colleges, and even, I don't know, you can read op-eds from the 60s and 70s, people saying colleges are too left wing or, some colleges too right wing. But I don't remember that ever being the case with sixth grade curriculum. All of a sudden now, anybody who's been paying attention in the Jewish community has been reading all of these pieces about ethnic studies and different bills. So we can talk about some of the work that you're doing on that in a second. But is this new?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For context, just to start off this conversation, our JPAC is a coalition of 38 major Jewish organizations across the state, and we've got folks who are doing work in so many different facets of Jewish life. Folks who are very committed to social services and civil rights, and others who are deeply invested in community security, and yet others who are thinking about education and anti-Semitism and how it manifests in schools, on campuses, online, and in society. And so there are a lot of different organizations that have a lot of different foci at this moment. And I think I've been able to learn a lot from our partners and our organization members throughout this process. I would say that we've seen a major uptick in harmful, problematic content, anti-Semitic, factually inaccurate content in high school and younger courses. I don't want to say the last couple of years, but I'd say in the last 5 to 10 years or so, specifically as we've seen a lot more of a what's the right word for it? Radical, politicized versions of campus fields of study enter the high school courses. So if I may, just kind of quick historical context of where the ethnic studies conversation comes from. Ethnic studies was founded in the Bay Area in the 60s and 70s and at UC Berkeley and San Francisco State. And it was always meant to be, I shouldn't say always meant to be, it started off as a college level field of study. It wasn't required. It was something that was a way to elevate the voices of communities of color and for specific groups: Black, Latino, Native Americans, and AAPI communities. And it was a way to say, hey, typically our courses uplift, center white Christian narratives. And this is a way for you to be able to share your stories, feel represented in the classroom, and teach others about your experiences. If done right, it's a really powerful way to help build empathy and understanding for other communities. And we saw that expand over the course of many, many years across college campuses across the country. When I was at UCLA, I know you and I were at UCLA together. When we were at UCLA, I think it was when you were also there as well, UCLA passed an ethnic studies requirement to graduate. That was a demonstration of how it was continuing to not just expand, but also become more and more mainstream on college campuses. That was what, 10, 15 years ago. We've also seen it become more and more common in high school courses. So we've seen it started to bleed into high school courses. Again, if done well, this could be great. The challenge is high school courses, high school students are at a different developmental level than college students. Their expectations of what they should learn in the classroom, how much they should be challenged, their developmental level is completely different. And so we need to make sure that we create, curriculum and standards and frameworks that align with what a high school student is meant to be taught. And we have that for every major course in high school. As ethnic studies has become more and more prevalent in high schools, they didn't have any of that guidance. So you see a lot of the more subversive, radical perspectives that are being taught on college campuses being taught now in high schools, even though it hasn't yet been adopted for what high schools, and as you point out, younger students are meant to learn about. So we've been seeing a lot of instances in recent years um, where students are being taught pretty um, political, biased, radical perspectives around issues that affect the Jewish community because there isn't really this adaptation for what's meant to be, grade appropriate. Um,
Even before that, sorry to cut you off. I'm just
oh, please.
I'm thinking about still the college ethnic studies before we even talk down about the trickle down to high school and middle school. There is, even in your description of it, 60s and 70s uplifting certain voices, there is a sense of normativity that comes with that is generally not considered academic in the sense of, you know courses and fields of study are supposed to be descriptive, not normative, generally, right? So you don't want I don't know, your political science teacher giving you, the norms of politics. Maybe if they write op-eds, sure, but in classes, the goal of a political science program should be to help students break down the complexities of politics, not give them, normativity of which parties and which ideas should be uplifted. I mean, so there is that tension there that I think is there from the beginning. The one other interesting thing, and I don't remember who this was, but I was talking to somebody who was an expert on American Jewish history, and we were comparing ethnic studies to a Jewish studies. And Jewish studies in America, one, Jewish studies goes back to, the Haskalah in the, 1800s with the German Wissenschaft school. And then Jewish studies came to America in about the 1920s, 1930s, long before the ethnic studies. And Jewish studies was always, much more, attempting to be descriptive to the sense where now even a lot of the Jewish community feels like the field of Jewish studies is actually contributing to hostility towards Israel. That's a whole other rabbit hole there. But, I'm wondering if you see that tension, because on the one hand, clearly it's a good thing for, yes, if all you read was, white Christian men your entire life, you are missing out on the vast majority of the human experience. On the other hand, a course that, is trying to teach you about a topic that specifically is saying, well, we only want this type of people, there is a little bit of a tension there that I think even gets deeper than, what happens if we actually disagree on, are Jews a nation or a religion, and where do Palestinians fit in?
It's a really good point, and it's a really interesting tension, and it's complicated, right? On college campuses, I think we do want to take classes where we're challenged to think critically, and there are different perspectives that come out. I think that's kind of the baseline for a typical class that might be required to graduate, or a class that you have the majority of people taking. There also are plenty of times on college campuses where we take classes that are deeply antithetical to our values, right? And there are people who say, I want to take this class because I want to be challenged. It's not exactly what I believe in. And maybe you're, you don't believe in climate change and there's a climate class, right? There are, there are plenty of opportunities in colleges to really push boundaries and get out of our comfort zones, speak out against the professor. And there's also something valuable there too. So I don't want to disagree with what you're saying, because I actually think the vast majority of classes are really meant to give you data points, push you to think critically and think differently. And then some also have slants. And in college, it's okay to have both of that. What's
You're
interesting.
actually reminding me. This is like a funny. You would appreciate this just from UCLA. You can probably imagine the people at play. I won't give their names, but I remember there was a group of people taking a class on dinosaurs, and they all certainly believe dinosaurs existed. But obviously, once you get in more into like the ultra orthodox community, they believe dinosaurs didn't exist. So this one group of people and rabbi would always call it, "Oh, you're going to your dinosaur mythology class," just as sort of like a joke.
Right. And it's I don't want that to I don't want to suggest at all that we should be going to college to be taught things that we don't agree with. I mean, that's just part of the experience. I mean, even outside of the classroom, I mean, some of my most formative experiences on campus were figuring out how to navigate Palestine Awareness Week on this big wall that was put up in the middle of campus that had a lot of really offensive stuff on it. And there were parents who would say to me all the time, I was a student body president my senior year. I wear a kippah. I was a very visible Jew, and people would say to me, "Is it safe for me to send my Jewish kid to UCLA?" And I would say, "Look, we've got a thriving Hillel. We had 300 people come to Shabbat dinner every Friday night. I had an amazing support community. I felt like I was incredibly welcome, and I was elected as a visibly Jewish student body president at UCLA, and ultimately became, I think, the second of what was 7 out of 8 straight Jewish student body presidents. I thought it was the glory days for Jews at UCLA, and yet." There were a lot of people who were really deeply concerned about sending their kids to school because there were things that were going to push them out of their comfort zone. That also bothered me, that I had to deal with Palestine Awareness Week while I was at school. And yet it was a growth opportunity. I learned how to elevate my voice. In fact, it pushed me into leadership. So I don't think of that necessarily as a negative, but having both of those opportunities in class and outside of class to really be challenged and to be thinking about how do we develop our leadership skills and our voice. I think that's what college is really all about. As classes become a little more mainstream, I do think that, yes, you probably have to have some sort of guardrails on campus. And what was really interesting to see is when UCLA created their ethnic studies requirement, it wasn't just this one-off ethnic studies class that was the same class for everybody. It was actually this menu of classes. You could take, yes, like kind of the history of, Chicano studies, or the Afro-American experience through slavery and Jim Crow, and or this catch-all ethnic studies course, but you could also take women's history, and Jewish history was included in that, right? So there were some classes that I thought were quite important and related to my own identities that fit in that ethnic studies menu of options, and some were less political, and some were more political, and some were less radical, and some were more. So as I mean, you see that trend as classes become more and more um, mainstream required, they also moderate a little bit and create that opportunity for disagreement and for nuance and for different perspectives. And so I think that's what's supposed to happen. And that's how, when done right, that's what happens on college campuses. And then you still have kind of those radical, challenging classes on the corners of campus, and that's also good for its own reasons too. I mean, getting back to the original question, the real challenge is as you normalize classes for requirements on college campuses, you have some, kind of less de-radicalization as part of that process. How do you then take that and put it in high schools or middle schools? And how do you continue that process of making it appropriate for all people, especially when you don't actually get that menu of classes? Now, if you're putting it in a high school course, it's not like it's an elective and you must take some of these menu one of these many classes that are offered. You get one course. You get 5 months to learn about all of these different communities, and one teacher has the skills to be able to, or is expected to have the skills to teach you about all of these experiences.
And also, I mean, so both obviously on the UC level and the high school level, this is taxpayer funded because it's a public school. But on the high school level, you can't even opt out, right? So, like legally, if you're a 15-year-old in Irvine or in Los Angeles, I mean, obviously there's homeschool and whatever, but for 99% of people that are going through the sort of, traditional high school experience, you actually have to be in those classes, and so there is.
Just to kind of nuance that, that's what's coming right now. What we're seeing, most of the experience that we've seen in the news are classes that are typically offered, and sometimes they're required, but the state has this new mandate coming down the pike that theoretically would make it required for all high school students. So yes, to your point, that's exactly what's coming. But I just wanted to.
No, please. Yeah, thank you. We also, I mean, even before we get to, the ethnic studies, involving, Israel, Palestinians, Jews, all of that, I mean, the sort of big debate that I think happened before this was around, let's say the New York Times 1619 project versus, how do you portray America? Because this was sort of the last, ethnic study, I don't know if anyone called it that, but sort of like the last ethnic studies, war going back and forth. And, I think almost like clockwork, you sort of had both sides take it too far. I mean, I don't know if you would agree with this, but just for me, pontificating from the outside, where you had, now you have conservative states that essentially are making it illegal to talk about Jim Crow, and, which just seems insane because that's, history. But then, then you have other groups that refuse to teach anything positive about the last 300 years of America and sort of ethnic studies, again, because it starts to creep to normativity. And again, it's almost impossible to study history without any type of normativity. But I think the question is where you have that balance. I think the fear, now getting into, Israel and Palestine and everything there is if this is going to be a situation for, real deep discovery and diving into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I don't think I know a single, I'm sure that guy exists, but like the majority of the Jewish community, would laud that. And even to the point of complexity of, read, anti-Zionist thinkers, liberal Zionists, right-wing Zionists, sort of take in the whole thing. The problem is that there seems to be this tinge of, well, this is really just activism that's being, I don't know, shielded as, genuine academic study, whether in the college levels and high school levels. And then, it seems scary, not just, to think that, okay, one day our children, if they go to public school, is going to have to sit in this class. But, the 99% of students who, in theory, if they're actually paying attention in class, which is a big if, their version of what their education is going to be is just going to be something that I just think is factually incorrect. And that's a big tension there, which does lead others. Just the last thing I want to say, and then because it seems like you're insinuating that ethnic studies generally is good, just certain applications are bad. But I think the argument against ethnic studies as a whole is why even let the government do this? This is something, yeah, they should take a very general history class, and history should just be facts and, database centric and, primary sources, but there shouldn't really be any overarching narrativization. So I don't want a high school teacher telling me either the United States has been systemically racist for the last 300 years and those systems continue to oppress people of color today. And I also don't want them saying, dominant American values have been very pro-liberalism and freedom. And it just so happens, okay, for, a historical fluke, America wasn't doing that, but now America is back on its, normative track. I don't want either of that narratizations. That can be done at home and at the library and, I don't know, on Reddit debates or, whatever have you. But I don't know. I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
No, it's a really interesting point, and I think your nuance is probably representative of a large chunk of our community and beyond the Jewish community. I mean, you saw, as you mentioned, like when this all broke many years ago, the New York Times, I think their position wasn't even about the Jewish issues. It was really about some of the language and the kind of extreme nature of the curriculum itself. And yet at the same time, like the Jewish community is very diverse, right? And my coalition is very diverse. And I've got folks who span the political spectrum who care deeply about this. And what we're trying to do is really figure out how to create an environment where the most people feel the most comfortable in schools. There are going to always be people who think that no matter what we do, it's the wrong solution. And that's just how the world works and how communal dynamics work. But at the end of the day, you can't have, I mean, I don't believe that anything can be fully unbiased, right? If we're gonna in a vacuum, let's look at the Holocaust, right? Can you teach about the Holocaust without saying that Hitler was bad? That's just not an appropriate way to do so. And by doing so, you're in a sense maybe even taking a political position that they're
But it wouldn't be the job. I mean, it's a really interesting example because obviously it's something that, both of us, of course, unequivocally think is bad, so we can play around with it. I wouldn't want the first day of, teaching about the Holocaust to say, we're going to unpack the evils of Nazi ideology, right? Like, I would want it to be, here are policies, and this is why these policies were discriminatory, and using like very descriptive language. Now, I want the students to conclude, okay, this is bad, morally, but I don't know if I would want the teacher to front that because that does create a slippery slope. Obviously, not, saying that every policy is Hitler, but when talking about, I don't know, whatever, current events you might have, I just think the more descriptive you are, people can then use their own moral tuning to figure out, what the right answer is. Or maybe the answer is, well, that shouldn't be done in public schools anyway. That should be done, parents should be able to do that, or, clergy, or, I don't know, camp counselors, whoever the people are that are sort of, extra governmental entities. So even that, I would hope everybody concluded that Hitler was evil, but I'm not sure if I would want the first slide to say like unpacking the moral ills of
yeah.
Nazism.
Well, I think that's an interesting point. I'm sure there are plenty of people in my world that would disagree with that and would want to explicitly see that. But I'll give you an interesting counterexample. I mean, a day there are hundreds of thousands of kids just in the Southern California region that spend a day at the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles or the Museum of Tolerance, right? And for many of them, that is their only experience doing any sort of Holocaust and genocide education. So they've got one day, right, to learn about the Holocaust. And they're going to go through this exhibit and have this really powerful experience. And maybe they don't explicitly say Hitler was bad in that exhibit, but for all intents and purposes, it is intent on getting you to that point. And it would actually I think be a real disservice if there was any opportunity for someone to walk out of the Holocaust Museum or the Museum of Tolerance and come to the conclusion, to any other conclusion than what the Nazis did was horrific. Right. And so I don't, and maybe we're parsing words at this point about like whether they explicitly say one very, very specific line or not, but there is a slant. And the slant is to ultimately be able to say what is good and what is bad. And that's what we want to teach people to help understand. And we want to build a generation of people who may not really know what the Holocaust was and educate them about how horrific it was and what we need to do in today's society to push back against that, right? And that might only happen in a day because you might only have a day. And that relates to the ethnic studies conversation in a really interesting way because you've got now, 4 or 5 months in a semester to teach a class that is meant to teach about the Black, Latino, Native American AAPI experiences, and then whatever other communities might have, demographic sizable populations in their communities. So in an area like the heart of LA, or in Irvine, you might say, hey, there's a big Jewish population here. We want to make sure that we also have a couple of days where we talk about the Jewish American experience. In Glendale, you might have that about the Armenian community, and in other parts of the state, the Sikh community might be super relevant, or the Hindu community, right? There are. So now you've taken a field of study and you've condensed it to this very small amount of time, but you have to teach about all these different things. You might only have a day, right? So how do you, with such limited time, ultimately bring people to a place where you want them to make them feel, and you want to make them empathize and understand where a community is coming from? And maybe it's not, the answer isn't, this group is good, this group is bad, this group is powerful, this group is oppressed. Like, maybe that's not the binary you want to create, but just teaching facts might not also get you to the point you need to get to.
It is interesting. A thought popped into mind. I don't know if I actually agree with what I'm about to say, but I figured I'll, put it in the air anyway. If somebody gave me the dichotomy of teaching about you give me a group of, 15-year-olds, you have 1 hour, 1 week to teach them about the Holocaust, or they don't get any education about it at all. I'm not convinced I'm taking that educational opportunity. And I say this as somebody who like very much values education, but there are some time, I mean, if you want to understand something that's, as nuanced and complex and, as much history, and it's not like the Holocaust is morally complex, of course, but the factors that went into it, I mean, are enormous. I was just actually, I'm going to put this podcast out before the podcast that I recorded earlier today, but we were talking about, also Holocaust curriculum. And I was saying, if I was teaching 4 sessions, I said this in the other podcast, if I was teaching 4 sessions on the Holocaust, the entirety of the first session would be about medieval Christian anti-Semitism, Martin Luther and his, German Protestant anti-Semitism, and then the Protocols of Elders of Zion, none of which are classically, again, historians and academics associate that with Hitler. But I'm going to guess maybe there's one slide of like, yes, people believe the Jews killed Jesus for a while, and that, but I don't know. I mean, if you only have 1 hour to teach about this, I think you're almost at risk of essentializing the evil of the Holocaust as like something that, oh, nobody can really understand and unpack this. But then it almost gives people the power to then use the Holocaust as sort of their benchmark example of evil, which is then how you get to fast forward, on college campuses, people actually saying, oh, Zionists are actually the Nazis, because for them, they just, they remember, oh, Nazis are just like the worst thing ever and morally bad. And so therefore, oh, we don't like what this group is doing. Oh, they must be Nazis too. And they do that totally unironically. Whereas, so I'm not sure. I think that there is a lot of tension there. Because also, I'm sure you're familiar with what's it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? So if you, know nothing about a topic, people report, I know nothing. But then, if you learn a little bit of a topic, people self-report they know a lot. And then if you know a medium to large amount of a topic, you actually say you don't know that much. And, so I'm worried about almost this effect too, where like, I mean, same with me. I took, a gender studies class at UCLA. And, to the extent that I spend a lot of time ripping on the field of gender studies, let's put that aside. But like, it would be chutzpahdik, in the most Jewish of senses, to think that I'm an expert on this topic because I took, 19 sessions of class. I don't know. I'm thinking about that. I don't know if I actually agree with that, but I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I don't I don't agree with it. To be frank, I think that building a generation of people that don't get to learn about the Holocaust is much riskier than building a generation of people who think they know a lot about the Holocaust and might not know that much. And yes, there are risks, and you outlined some of the unintended consequences. I don't think that undermines the value that we need to get about teaching about the most horrific genocide in a generation, and validating the fact that it can happen again. And we need to be mindful of it, right? There are total misappropriations of the Holocaust, and we need to fight that too. But I don't think the answer is shy away from it altogether. So I don't know.
No, I think that's totally fair. So what is the current status? I guess just to we can talk facts for a second. What is actually the current status with the ethnic study? I mean, I feel like it's one of those things where if you don't pay attention for a month, so many things have changed. So give us the, what is
Right.
current?
So, yeah, I mean, so I outlined for you where the debate comes from in my last kind of points about why, the fact-based model versus the kind of rhetorical political model is there's a lot of different perspectives on both. And I want to be very clear. I don't position myself anywhere particularly in that spectrum. I just want to make sure that we've got a basic understanding of why people come to this from different perspectives. What we're seeing happen in the classroom is more and more school districts are teaching ethnic studies for various reasons. For in A couple of years ago, it was because ethnic studies was becoming more and more popular, and people wanted to offer it in their schools. So that was becoming a popularized thing just on merits. In 2016, the state of California said, as more and more schools are going to teach ethnic studies, we should have this age-appropriate, state-approved model curriculum that school districts can use. So they passed a law requiring the Department of Education to create a model curriculum that would be guidance for school districts who wanted it. In 2019, the first draft of this model curriculum came out, and it was this 1,000-page document with a lot of content for a lot of different communities, and it had some really problematic stuff in it for the Jewish community. There was stuff about Jewish control of the media and stereotypes generalizing Jews as thinking that Arabs are terrorists. There was this long list of forms of oppression that listed, what you'd expect: racism and sexism and homophobia and Islamophobia. It also had things like capitalism in there and cis heteropatriarchy, kind of getting back to your normalist point from earlier. And it completely omitted anti-Semitism as a prevalent form of discrimination in society today. That erasure is deeply problematic. So it had anti-Semitic content. It erased anti-Semitism as a modern contemporary form of discrimination that exists. It was kind of riddled with a bunch of different references to anti-Zionist content and BDS as this popular social movement, and it completely erased any other acknowledgement of the American Jewish experience. So here you've got this curriculum that is meant to alleviate bias that ultimately only talks about Jews in this incredibly biased and harmful way. Jews were the oppressor colonial estate. They control the media. They aren't oppressed themselves, like all of these things, and no positive representation. And that was deeply alarming to us and to so many in the Jewish community. And after a multi-year public engagement campaign, we ultimately got the curriculum to address all of our core concerns. I mean, right after this thing came out, we put out tens of thousands of comments. The governor said this will never see the light of day. The state superintendent fired all of the authors of the first draft. And we went through this process whereby the state ultimately got all of our concerns addressed. They removed the anti-Semitic pieces. They added anti-Semitism in there multiple times as a common form of discrimination. There were two unprecedented lesson plans about the Jewish American experience, one about Jewish diversity and one about Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, which is really, I think, beautiful. And we were able to get the state to approve this curriculum. The challenge then came. The state later that year, this is 2021, passed a law that said which I referred to earlier, all school districts have to offer ethnic studies by the 2025-26 school year, which is coming up in September, and all school districts have to make it a high school graduation requirement by 2030. So more and more schools are now teaching ethnic studies, not just because they wanted to offer it, but because they have to. Now, the challenge with that law, which was monumental at the time, the challenge is that it pointed to the model curriculum as a version that you could teach, but it also said you could create your own if you wanted to do so. And that loophole has created a lot of problems for us. The authors of that first problematic draft that were ultimately fired and said that the final curriculum didn't represent them, they said that it didn't represent them because they were competing against right-wing zealots and Zionists. They specifically broke off and said, we're going to create our own version of this curriculum called the Liberated Ethnic Studies curriculum. That the fundamental difference between what they want to teach in the classroom and what the state is saying you should teach in the classroom is they want to teach anti-Zionism and not have any sort of positive representation of the Jewish American experience. And a lot of the anti-Zionist curriculum that they teach is completely factually inaccurate. We're seeing this over and over and over again. It just basically portrays Jews as coming to Israel for the first time in 1947 and eradicating the Palestinians. There's just no nuance and no understanding of the actual history there. And then when you have that coupled with no positive representation of Jews, the natural tendency for a student is to think that Jews are inherently oppressive and bad. And that's not the culture we want to create. So they're shopping around their version of this curriculum to oftentimes ignorant school districts, sometimes intentionally problematic school districts, but most of the time it's ignorant school districts saying, hey, you have this requirement coming up. Let us help you implement it. and they're pushing forward a curriculum that is inherently problematic and harmful to Jewish students.
And I'm
Um,
going to guess there's also a large dose of anti-Americanism, right? Because it sort of always comes, in lockstep, right? And so anti-Zionism is problematic, I think, for the Jewish community, but there is sort of this meta question here of it does seem funny and strange. We just both filed taxes 3 days ago, and California state taxes. It's one of the higher ones in the country, and so essentially some of our hard-earned money is going to, at least in some schools, and if some people would have their way, to actually convince people that this is a rotten country, and to say nothing about the Jewish experience. I mean, this is precisely, I mean, because I've struggled a lot with political allegiances in the last couple of years. I was sort of very vocal about that. I didn't ultimately vote for Trump in the last election, but I did think it was a question, unlike 2020, where for me there was no question that people should vote against him. And this is just what drives people to the right. And I'm somewhat hesitant to bring this up, but the sort of the other big debate, we can decide if we want to weigh down this or not, is Trump, now withholding federal money from colleges because of essentially the same thing, which, also, I don't really want big government, and certainly I don't want Trump deciding what one learns, because that seems, insane. But on the other hand, I don't want my tax money to go to inculcating people to think that America is some, devilish, I don't know, minority hating country. That's just also not, that's not helpful. And sort of, all the reasons why I think one should want to fund public education, because it helps this, spirit of, nationalism, not right-wing nationalism, but just a sense that we're all part of this, project together, and it's better to have better educated people. Like, most of the ethnic studies classes, and I don't know if you'll agree with this. I won't say, you probably will or won't. I almost think the country would be better if nobody ever took a gender studies class. Like, it's not even that I think, oh, if there's extra money, like, I just think there'd be less division. I think that there would be, so almost, what is stopping somebody from like hearing all this and saying, I don't even want to be a part of this conversation. I just want, whatever the right wing is doing. Okay, that seems to make a lot of sense. Let's go all in on that. Because that is sort of my Yetzer Hara that's pulling me in that direction.
Oh, well, no, I hear that, and I mean, like I said earlier, I don't really believe that something can be apolitical, right? So, if you make a decision not to teach about gender studies or not to teach about, Jim Crow or whatever it is, that in itself is a political decision. You're choosing not to educate people about a specific dynamic that ultimately could help formulate their perspectives on how to engage with people.
But kind of, right? Like, there is a sense, like, let's kind of dig in on gender studies, right? So that the sort of basic framework of, a humanities gender studies curriculum is this idea that gender is a social construct versus sex, which is much more biological. That is an open question, right? Like, that's not a fact. That is, some people decide to believe that, and other people, to me, that's, I don't know, it's equivalent to any other, ideological thing that one would debate. So in a gender, I wouldn't want my taxpayer money, or my daughter, when she, if and when she goes to public school, being told by a teacher one way or another. I want them to learn biology, certainly. And I want, maybe they can learn about some of the barriers to polite society and the workforce and whatever that women have faced historically. That's, factual. But then once you get into the ideology, which again, these courses are soaked in ideology, and on the first day, oh, there's this thing called gender, and that has nothing to do with sex, and something that, again, I think the jury's still out on that. I don't, but instead the courses are almost all front loading that. So I think that's more, because hearing about the liberated ethnic studies curriculum, it's just, it's almost, one response is, well, of course this is going to happen, because once we talk about ethnic studies, we're talking a lot more about subjectivity than objectivity. In other words, how has this community, experienced this, as opposed to, more of a top-down approach, what's actually going on. And so then, of course, you're going to have battles over the different subjective experience. I totally get that from their subjective experience, even though I don't think this is objectively true, there are Palestinians who feel like they are the victim of a Naziist white supremacist ideology. That is a true subjective feeling that they have. It's not objective, though. And so, there are people who look at humans and think they are the product of God having created them 6,000 years ago, and that is their subjective experience of the world. but that shouldn't, be inserted into I think that was also a big debate in high school, 20 years ago. And the answer is like, let's just teach what we kind of know. I guess I might, I think what this comes down to is I think I disagree with your premise of everything being political. I mean, obviously there is a spectrum from, okay, chemistry is probably, almost all apolitical versus, I don't know, history, which tends to be more political. But I think there is a way to do it that kind of excises most of the political bias from it versus a way to do it where my sense is, and this is much more on the college level because I understand that a lot better than what's going on in high schools, where it's bad to be apolitical and it's bad, you almost want your, X, Y, or Z professor to, when you go to office hours to have the big poster saying, you know, I am pro this or anti this and whatever. And that's just a very different, that's just strange that,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, it's interesting. I think you raised a lot of interesting points. And when I'm hearing you talk, I'm actually hearing you kind of elevate how it's so hard it is to be apolitical, right? You talk about creationism, and we, many of us think that creationism is no longer a relevant or appropriate thing to be teaching in the classroom. But there was a point where that was, and it still is for some people, a really prescient perspective to have. And so I think that when I say it's hard to be apolitical, what I really mean is that everything has people who disagree with you on.
No, of
And
course, but for the
like,
creationists,
where
no,
is
no,
the normative perspective in the world? Where is kind of that, where is that fallen? I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about. And so for certain issues, it's become more and more, certain things have become more and more of a wedge issue, and other things have become more and more accepted as fact, even though at a point they weren't. And so I think what you're raising is actually the critical point that we need to hone in on here, which is um, one might say, to your point, in my mind, right? This isn't me, right? In my mind, what Israel is doing to Palestinians is really horrific, and there's no subjectivity to it. This is what it is, right? Um, but that's not where we are. That's not where the vast majority of Americans are. And so it would be wholly unfair to say that society has moved us to that place where it is no longer a wedge issue, because it is something that we want to make sure is taught in an unbiased way. And now it's really hard to say anything can be unbiased, but as close as possible. I mean, I think you started this conversation by saying it would be great if in our schools we had people read pieces that were critical of Zionism and then other pieces that talk about the foundation of Zion, right? Like having that dynamism and nuance and differing perspectives might actually be the most beautiful way to bring education in. But I think we're both elevating this perspective that purely being objective or apolitical is almost an impossible goal. We need to figure out, and it's
no,
and
no,
it's
you're totally right that it's impossible. I think where I'm at is some people are trying and other people aren't. And what I'm sort of levying my concern at is the, liberated ethnic studies bunch, they are not trying.
right, right,
And versus, I think, I would love, even though I think anti-Zionism in 2025 is sort of a, an incorrect position, both factually and morally. I would want students to engage in my sort of ideal type of, class or university, or even, what I bring to Hillel students. I want them to engage with these arguments seriously versus I think another side where, just the entire idea of anti-normalization, which I'm sure you also came into contact with when you were at UCLA, is just, well, there are some opinions that we don't even want to hear from, which is almost this, well, that's not the academic way. And we're talking about academics right now. So the academic way is not to say, I only want to hear from one perspective. It's, the sort of, First Amendment liberal, let's hear all the views and let's see which rise to the surface. And, the best, at least the theory that our country uses is, the best ideas rise to the surface and then those kind of become accepted as truth. And no side, no one group or side has a monopoly on this. Whereas
right.
this is very much saying, no, the side is claiming to have a monopoly on the truth. And, it would be one thing if they were just, a private entity or a group on campus like Students for Justice in Palestine. It's another once they're now, which I'm sure you spend your day dealing with. Once we're now talking about publicly funded things, things that our money is going to and our kids are going to be in one day. This is like a whole different conversation of like, I don't want the people who are coming in with sort of the activist lens. But maybe you're right. Maybe okay, you're gonna have something like ethnic studies, and then like what's the best way to like parse in between that?
Yeah. I love this conversation because it's really allowing us to dig deep and parallel a lot of different things. One other thing that I think is worth bringing into this conversation that we haven't really mentioned yet, specifically with regards to ethnic studies, is um, it would be great if, and there was a place probably in the classroom to have this deep dive understanding about all the different perspectives around Israel and Palestine, right? Like that could be done well, and there is a world in which that's possible. But to your point earlier, when talking about the Holocaust, that maybe can't be done in a day. Right, you need to really draw that out, and so what we're seeing in ethnic studies right now is it's trying to be filtered down to a very short period of time. And the other context here is that it oftentimes Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the only experience of foreign conflict, of a non-domestic experience that's being taught in ethnic studies. So not only are we seeing it in a particularly biased way, targeting Israel and the Jewish community, but it's oftentimes also the the exception to what is meant to often to be a course about the domestic experience of communities of color. So if someone takes a course and learns only about what it's like to be a Black, Latino, Native, or AAPI person in America and the challenges and tribulations that come with that, and also kind of the really beautiful demonstrations of contributions to society of those communities, that's all great. And then they have in the same course a 2 or 3 day experience about Israel's colonization, right, or oppressive nature towards Palestinians, and that's being drawn as parallel to what we're seeing happen to communities of color. Like this is a double standard, and taking Israel completely out of the global context for what is historically meant to be a domestic course. And so that is also challenging. It would be great to find the place for that long conversation. Um, Ethnic studies doesn't have the time, nor is it the space for that. And so we'd love to make this a course that teaches about what it's like to be an Arab American or Palestinian American in America, right? But not what's necessarily happening halfway around the world in a much more nuanced situation. We'd also love, similarly, for this to be a course about what it's like to be a Jewish American in America, and not necessarily what's happening halfway around the world in a very complicated and nuanced situation.
No, it definitely seems tough. So what is, I mean, I'm on your email list, so you have, a very impressive group of speakers coming out to the convention. I think it's what, May 5th and 6th, so I'll plug it for you so you don't have to. I mean, I'll let you plug it at the end. But so if anybody is interested that's listening to this, are these the conversations? I mean, I just saw you were having, Katie Porter, who's now, announced she's running for governor. You have the chancellor at UCLA. Those were just the last two emails I got. Are these the conversations that you are having with them actively of trying to parse out these tensions? Is it very much, I guess, what is it like, what is JPAC actually doing sort of behind the scenes when you sit down with
Yeah.
California governor or senators or anything there
Yeah.
in regards to this?
Well, we're blessed. We've got a really incredible relationship with Governor Newsom. And as I mentioned, when this ethnic studies fight started a couple of years ago, he immediately came out and said this was never going to see the light of day. He that ethnic studies requirement bill that I mentioned, he even vetoed an earlier version of it, saying until the curriculum is fixed, we're not going to mandate ethnic studies in the classroom. In the aftermath of October 7th, he visited Israel with a plane full of aid. We organized a meeting with a bunch of Jewish leaders with him within a month of October 7th, and we said to him, we really want you to put out a statewide all of society plan to counter anti-Semitism. And his response was, I love it, I'm in. And we worked with him over the course of 6 months to put together a first in the nation statewide plan to counter anti-Semitism, which he calls the Golden State Plan, to counter anti-Semitism. And that was done about a year ago, really monumental. And that's just some examples. I mean, he's put record amount of aid towards security grants. He's supported our Holocaust and genocide education work. I mean, he's done so much for our community, and he's set to term out in a couple of years. And so we think it's critically important to have that relationship with future governors, because they and the legislature are key to our safety and security and prosperity in California. So Katie Porter is one of the leading candidates for governor who'll be speaking at our conference. We will be announcing a couple others in the coming days, a little bit of a sneak peek there. And our hope is that we can build those relationships early. We want to make sure that we can hear from them about how they're positioning themselves on issues of Jewish safety and security, and on Israel. And this is an opportunity for them to do so in the most high-profile gathering of California Jews that we have all year. And so there will be a number of California governors who are going to be able to speak to us, hear how the audience responds to them, and ultimately make the case for why they should be our next governor. And that may have a big impact on how the election goes.
That's really interesting. Yeah, one of the things that, people who have listened to this podcast for a while, have heard me talk about a bunch, but in the, election, this is almost a year ago now, I reached out to both both candidates, Republican and Democrat, that were running for California 47th. And they both agreed, Scott Baugh and Dave Min, to be on this podcast. I first talked with Scott Baugh. I actually had him on twice. Great conversations. And Dave Min's campaign essentially agreed and then kept changing the time.
Right.
And then, it got to the point where it was like, 4 or 5 months now. And then I ended up talking to somebody who knew him that was basically like, he's too afraid to go on the record with anything about, Israel or anti-Semitism and doesn't want to be pushed. And so, that was sort of my experience. But I think it is interesting to have the sort of larger, if you have something like JPAC or, I don't know if you would say this, but, in my head, also because it rhymes, like I think of APAC as very similarly, again, APAC is a much more, Israel centric, and that's sort of all they care about. Sometimes, critics of APAC will say, even at risk of the American Jewish community, they care, about only what Israel wants. But, I still generally think APAC does good work where you almost kind of give politicians a forced choice to be on the record about these things as opposed to a podcast like this. You can just as easily ignore it and, who's going to care about. So, I mean, I'm curious, how is it hard to get people to, somebody like Katie Porter? I can imagine actually, because Katie Porter is a professor at UCI. I know a lot of people who know Katie quite well. And they've said that, she's very nice, but she is very wishy-washy on certain questions about Israel and the Jewish community. And their hunch is the reason is because, again, if you're going to run for California governor and, there's, or if there's going to be any sort of primary, she's going to need to cultivate a lot more of the, progressive vote than, in the mainstream election, which then she can kind of like tack to the middle. So, nobody wants to be on record saying, I don't know, I support aid to Israel, or whatever. Like, is this a hard ask for politicians? Is there ever, this might be an unfair question to you, is there ever a conversation that goes like, I'm happy to be on a panel or to speak, but just don't ask me any questions about X, Y, or Z? Does that ever come up?
Yeah, well, so what's interesting is that despite our name being JPAC, we are not a PAC. We're not a political action committee. We're a public affairs committee, and so we don't even get involved actively in campaigns. We do the lobbying side of things. So once they're elected, our job is to make sure that they're furthering policy initiatives that benefit the Jewish community. So it's a little bit of a different space for us, especially when we're talking about candidates for governor. We're
Sure,
not.
but even APAC was not a formal pack until like what they changed their
Yeah.
thing like 3 years ago. But like back in the day, I don't know if you ever went as a student, but I remember every year UCLA would take like a whole ship full of us to there, and then I actually took some students, back when APAC was doing this pre-COVID, and it would be really interesting because you would have all these, I remember Kamala Harris, spoke at one of them, and it was funny because when she was running in the election this past cycle, I actually saw clips that progressives were showing. You sort of had these, anti-Kamala, anti-Israel cohort that, who knows how much of an effect they had in the election, but they would play clips from APAC, and I remember I was like, oh, I was there, and there, I think APAC essentially did its job to some point, of like forcing politicians who are known to be sort of like wishy-washy to actually, with all the cameras pointed at them, say, I believe X or I believe Y. Of course, they can change their mind later. That's, not odd, but at least, politicians know this could be used as either pro or anti fodder. So it's kind of more on that angle of like, do you ever have that tension when you're having, a Gavin Newsom who probably wants to run for president in the next couple of years, or someone like Katie Porter who's, clearly running for governor, like all of that. Is there any situation of like, well, I don't know if I want to be on record talk, because even to the point where, talking about security for synagogues, which seems somewhat non-controversial, is controversial. I'm guessing. Like I'm guessing there are groups that would say, well, we shouldn't be spending money on this. There are minority communities that per capita have much less wealth than the Jewish community. Why should we be funding these? And also, most of these synagogues are also associated with Israel. And so, rather than, JCCs and federations and Hillels and synagogues being able to apply for these state grants, they're all Zionist organizations anyway. So, like, I'm sure that debate happens also. So,
Yeah. No, well, there's certainly challenges with every single one of our policy initiatives. Funding for synagogues. I mean, first of all, that funding is available not just to synagogues, but to churches and mosques and other at-risk institutions. But yeah, it's a challenge because the state has a finite amount of resources, and particularly in recent years, we've been in a deficit, and so we've always had to fight to say this is a priority, and that means it has to be a priority over something else. So something else has to lose for something else for this to be included. So that's kind of the dynamic around security, and one of the to your point, I think one of the more challenging issues we faced last year in one of our bills that we were authoring was around um, Holocaust and genocide education, which again, you might think, is that really controversial? And yet CARE and Jewish Voice for Peace came out and said, until Holocaust and genocide education teaches about the genocide in Gaza, we're opposed to this. And that was deeply, deeply challenging for us and shocking. I mean, absolutely shocking. To say we're going to hold up education about not just the Holocaust, but also the Armenian and Cambodian and Native and Rwandan genocides until we acknowledge this other thing that's happening that is by no means a genocide, right? As one. We've seen some really surprising pushback on, to your point, a lot of different items in different ways. And yeah, it's really important, I think, for us to give people a platform, especially in a moment where some of these candidates are running for governor, to be able to say what some of their top priorities are. And it certainly is a way to hold them accountable. If they commit to certain things, yeah, of course they can change their mind later, but it really helps when we've gotten a commitment to them to do so. They understand that our community is a powerful voting bloc. And so this is an opportunity for them to get in front of the biggest gathering of California Jews each year, and to be able to make the case for why their values align with what they think we care about. And then it gets them to be able to say, ultimately, some things that we're going to need commitments from them later on. It's not obviously a done deal, but it certainly helps us. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if I think the APAC and JPAC comparison is perfectly fair, because the Israel conversation at federal level is a little more of a political wedge issue than supporting Jewish issues at the state level. As I mentioned, there's opposition for various reasons, but it's on the whole, people want to support the Jewish community. They should, and most do in elected office in many ways. But it's a little bit of a different dynamic. But at the same time, they're ultimately similar end goals. We want to make sure that they know what our community cares about, can speak to that, and then we can really hold them to their commitments.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know we've been talking for about an hour. We ended up talking mostly about ethnic studies. Is there anything else? I mean, any other topics that you're like, oh, I really would like to talk about this? And
I appreciate that. I mean, the one thing we talked a little bit about Holocaust education, almost as a corollary to ethnic studies, but I do just want to mention that is a really hot topic in our work at the state level these days. And I just maybe want to share a couple of things that have happened. In 1985, the state passed a law that requires Holocaust education for all high schools, and we suspected, I should say, that mandate wasn't being met. So a couple of years ago, we worked on a bill that would have created a council to study how well Holocaust and genocide education are being taught. The bill ultimately was absorbed by the governor. The governor said, one of the other many things he's done that have been, I think, really helpful to our community, don't even worry about trying to get this through the legislature. I'm going to do this by executive action and make it the governor's council on Holocaust and genocide education. And he did, and he appointed a number of our community leaders and legislators to run this council. And we asked him to put money towards it, and he did. And ultimately, this council worked on a massive multi-year study on how well Holocaust and genocide education was being taught in classrooms, and make recommendations to fill the gap. That study was released I think it was last month or 2 months ago, and put out results that are shocking but not surprising. It said that of all the districts in the state, there's 1,000 school districts in California. 26% of them are offering Holocaust and genocide education. 26% are offering it. And of those 26% of those districts, 72% of them are requiring it. So a sizable subset of them aren't even requiring the course. And of those who are, a lot of them are just a day trip to a Holocaust museum. No pre-work, no post-discussion, none of that. To I think the point that you were making, how do we really internalize this? And what does this mean? None of that work is happening in a lot of different spaces. So we suspected, and now we know that we've got a lot of work to do to fill that gap. And why is it so important? Not just because I think we're alarmed that every subsequent generation knows less and less about the Holocaust, and that's scary from a historical lens, but also because learning about the Holocaust is contemporary anti-Semitism training, and it's anti-hate training. And when we teach people about the horrors of Holocausts and genocides and what happens when hatred and bigotry go unchecked, we ultimately teach a generation of students to be more tolerant, to speak up against hatred and bigotry, and to develop empathy and understanding for other people. So it's a critical, proactive form of anti-Semitism education, and it just doesn't exist in our schools in a meaningful way. So we've got a bill. We worked on a bill last year that was ultimately, that's the one I mentioned, that was opposed by JVP and CARE, to create a statewide collaborative on Holocaust and genocide education. And it's creating curricular material and teacher training programs to help schools who aren't teaching the field of study, to help them get there. And then we're working on a bill this year to implement a couple of the recommendations from the study to require school districts to report on how they're meeting the state mandate, and to create a grant program for those who aren't yet teaching it in an appropriate way to help get them there. So I think that that's just something that's critical to mention that's happening now. It is, in addition to kind of the ethnic studies piece, which is a little more reactive. We want to make sure that as ethnic studies is implemented, it's not harming Jewish students. We're responding to some negative content in classrooms. We're also at the same time pushing forward what we think is the most effective way to proactively teach empathy, understanding, and tolerance in the classroom as well.
Is there anything about this might be, sort of a little bit of a tangent, but is there anything about left-wing anti-Semitism, like about either, Soviet Union, 60s, 70s, 80s, or, the new left, modern day America, progressive because there is a fear also that, when I think of the anti-Semites in 2025 that I'm the most afraid of, they're sort of in three different categories. One is old school Nazis, the second is Islamists, and the third is progressives. And so that seems to only capture one third of, what I am actively worried about on a day-to-day basis. So I'm curious, if that's because that sort of is, the sort of the quip that America's always, training for the last war, So, are we doing that? Are we only educating about the last major anti-Semitic, I guess the Soviet Union was, before
Sure.
after the Holocaust, but, that seems to be, because everyone's heard of the Holocaust, or not everybody, given this conversation, but, the vast majority of college students today have heard of the Holocaust in some capacity and know it had something to do with anti-Semitism, right-wing fascism, Hitler, and that's all bad. But Soviet anti-Semitism, which of course, not nearly as bad in terms of numbers as the Holocaust, but in some sense, the reverberation of the Soviet Union's anti-Semitism in the 70s and 80s is just as, has just as big of an effect on our lives as Nazi anti-Semitism that, for a whole variety of great reasons, the Western world has sort of evolved past the sort of 20th century protocols of Elders of Zion. Jews have some rotten DNA anti-Semitism too now, you know, some more Soviet, Jews have, too much control and they have control over politics and, where does Israel fit into the, so I don't know, just a question.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, as I mentioned, Holocaust and genocide education is less about the historical components of it and more about how do you stand up against bigotry and bias and hatred, right? And I think that that does cover the spectrum in a much broader way than just the historical nature of what Holocaust education would be. I mean, you go to the Museum of Tolerance, and you don't learn about the Holocaust. You go through their major anti-Semitism exhibit. You don't learn about the Holocaust until about two-thirds of the way through. So it is one massive historical moment. That serves as an example of what happens when bigotry goes unchecked. But the lessons in Holocaust and genocide education expand far beyond just Nazism and right-wing anti-Semitism, right? It's really about what do we do and what do we say? What are some of the tropes that can help get us to these places? The Holocaust didn't exist in a vacuum, right? And you could take several other different forms of anti-Semitism to get society to a place whereby you've now pit Jews as an outcast and not worthy of being there in society. And so I think that lesson transcends Holocaust and genocide education, and it allows you to build school tools and skill sets to be able to speak up against all the different forms of hatred and bigotry against the Jewish community, as you mentioned, and also in other communities that's in it. The one other thing I should mention is an item that we worked on last year that was also signed into law despite massive pushback from CARE and JVP and folks on the left, which essentially says on college campuses, where we're seeing a lot of some of this really problematic anti-Semitism coming from the left. It says on college campuses, if you're going to do any sort of anti-bias or anti-discrimination or what some might call DEI training, if you're going to teach it at all to any group of people on campuses, you must include anti-Semitism training. And the way that we made that happen is we ultimately made a law that says if you're going to do any sort of anti-discrimination training, you have to teach about the 5 most targeted groups based on an annual report put out by the Attorney General. And if you look back through years of data, the Attorney General's hate crime report every single year in California says that the Jews are consistently in the top 5 most targeted groups. And the most recent data we have is from 2023, and in a couple months we'll get 2024 data. But 2023 data put us as the second most targeted group in all of California. Despite being 3% of the state's population, we make up 60-70% of the religious motivated hate crimes, and somewhere in the teens in terms of the total number of hate crimes. So that's not just Holocaust education. That's saying if you're going to teach about what anti-Semitic or how anti-hate or how hate manifests on college campuses, you got to teach about how anti-Semitism manifests, working with mainstream groups of that community. So that would also be a way to kind of help in a very specific hostile situation, help teach about all the different forms of anti-Semitism and how to recognize it and speak out against it.
That sounds great. I mean, both with, Hillel's, Chabad's, API, I don't know if, I'm sure there's a fourth and fifth that are, very far behind in terms of what's mainstream on college campuses for Jewish organizations. But I feel like, I don't know, that would be a very interesting world if that happened. I'm hopeful, but but I'm not,
Yeah,
I am a little skeptical of, the world of DEI and the mainstream Jewish world ever being able to
sure.
rekindle. But,
Well,
but, but
the law officially took effect January 1 of this year. So it's still very early to find out how effective it's been. But we've got, as you mentioned, like we've got these folks on campuses who are both going to be involved in these conversations and also in many ways going to be the watchdogs. If they find out that there are any sort of any department that does a DEI training for educators, if someone gets a whiff of that not having anti-Semitism training, we can figure out how to get that back to state leaders, and there can be accountability measures taken. So I agree that the idea seems far-fetched, but once you put it into statute and you have oversight mechanisms and people in place to kind of notice when things aren't being met, like there's a lot more incentive to get to a place we want to get to.
no, that sounds great. That sounds, yeah, fingers crossed.
Exactly.
I know registration closes in 3 days. I'm going to put this out, ASAP. So, this will be live before Shabbat today. Anything else, that, people should know about you, about JPAC, about the conference, about anything else?
I already previewed. We've got a couple of other exciting speakers that we haven't yet to announce that will come out in a couple of days too. We're expecting between 600 and 700 Jewish leaders from across the state coming up to Sacramento this year. It's a 2-day conference. There will be incredible, educational opportunities, networking opportunities, and of course, we teach you how to lobby and actually send you to Capitol Hill in Sacramento and do the actual lobbying. And doesn't require any experience. We've got people from all different experience levels, and the vast majority are lobbying for the first time. And I think it's just find it a very empowering opportunity. From JPAC's perspective, having a sizable group of people coming up to Sacramento every year, and this will be our biggest conference ever, really helps further this work. This one day has an impact that reverberates far beyond our lobbying experience, because legislators see how many people are committed to supporting the Jewish community's issues and values, who are taking time off of work, away from family commitments, traveling up to Sacramento in the middle of the week because they want to speak about issues that are important to them. So when we continue to work on lobbying on these issues later on in the year, they remember back to how many people were committed to this during this conference, and it just goes a long way. So we shared in this conversation a couple of really great successes we had last year that are a direct manifestation of having 500 folks up in Sacramento last year. This year's policy agenda is even more ambitious, and as I mentioned, the ethnic studies bill might be the hardest one I've worked on in my time. So we need all the support we can get, and I think it's mutually beneficial for those of you who can come and also for our work. So appreciate the opportunity to plug.
No, of course. With a 9-week-old baby, I'm not going to make it this year, but I think saying things on a podcast is contractually binding. I will make it out one of the years because it sounds incredible, and I would really love to be there. So anyway, best of luck, and thank you again.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for chatting.